The dust of Pine Ridge tasted of grit and failed promises. It settled on the brim of Cole Blackwood's hat, coated the worn leather of his boots, and dusted the shoulders of a coat that had seen too many winters. He stood before the teller's cage in the Montana Territorial Bank, a quiet ghost amidst the bustle of a town, clawing its way toward respectability. The bank smelled of old paper-oiled steel and the faint cloying scent of other men's ambitions. On the polished wood of the counter, Cole's deerskin pouch lay next to a small brass scale. Its contents a glittering mound of gold dust, the silent wages of 5 years of solitude. Ought to be enough for credit at the general store through the winter, Mr. Blackwood the teller, a young man with a wispy mustache and nervous eyes, said as he meticulously weighed the last of the dust. Cole merely nodded, his gaze distant. His business was almost done. Soon he could retreat back to the silence of his cabin, back to the jagged peaks of the bitter roots that tore at the sky like broken teeth, a landscape that matched the geography of his own soul. His hand drifted to his chest, fingers brushing against the familiar cool weight of the silver locket beneath his shirt. It was a subconscious gesture, a constant silent conversation with the two faces immortalized within his wife, Mary. Her smile as gentle as a summer dawn, and his son Daniel, his eyes wide with a future he would never see. The locket was all that remained, the last physical proof that Cole Blackwood had once been a man capable of love, not just a specter haunted by its absence. The calm shattered with the violence of a dropped pane of glass. The bank's front doors burst inward, slammed against the walls with a cannon crack of splintering wood. 3 men stormed in their faces, obscured by grimy bandanas, their hands filled with the cold, hard authority of Colt revolvers. The low murmur of commerce died, replaced by a collective, sharp intake of breath. Nobody move a muscle. The leader barked, his voice a gravelly rasp. He was a broad, powerful man, his movements radiating a brutal confidence. This is a withdrawal. Panic, sharp and acrid, filled the air. The young teller's hands shot up his face, a mask of pale terror. Customers flattened themselves against the floor, their aspirations of wealth and prosperity forgotten in the sudden, stark reality of survival. Cole didn't move. He remained standing at the counter, a pillar of stillness in the swirling chaos. His training, the deeply ingrained instincts of a man who had once been called the Ghost, screamed at him to act. His body was a coiled spring, his mind calculating angles, counting threats, noting the way the second robber's eyes kept darting toward the door, a sign of a weak link. But that part of him was dead. He had buried it 5 years ago, along with his badge, his name, and his heart. This was not his fight. He had no stake in this town, no investment in its future. He wanted only to be left alone with his ghosts. The leader vaulted over the counter, shoving the terrified teller against the wall, while the other 2 men herded the customers into a tight, trembling group. One of them, a wiry man with shifty rat-like eyes, moved down the line of prone bodies, kicking aside bags and collecting any visible valuables. When he reached Cole, the only man still standing, he paused. On the floor, Old Man the robber snarled, gesturing with his pistol. Cole's eyes, the color of a winter sky, met the man's. They were flat empty of fear, and in their depths the robber saw a coldness that gave him a moment's pause. Cole slowly raised his hands, a gesture of compliance that cost him more than the man would ever know. It was a surrender to the life he had chosen, a life of non-involvement. The wiry man's gaze fell upon the small deerskin pouch of gold dust still sitting on the counter. He snatched it, then his eyes caught something else, the glint of a silver chain disappearing beneath the collar of Cole's shirt. "What's this?" he sneered, reaching out. "Don't." Cole's voice was low, a rumbling threat that came from deep within the earth. It was the first word he had spoken, and it carried the weight of a dozen graves. The robber hesitated, unnerved by the sudden shift in the man's demeanor. But greed and the bravado of holding a gun won out. With a swift, brutal tug, he ripped the locket from Cole's neck. The chain snapped, stinging Cole's skin. The silver oval engraved with the initials MB fell into the robber's grimy palm. Something inside Cole broke. It was not a loud, shattering thing, but a quiet tectonic shift. The carefully constructed dam of apathy he had spent 5 years building crumbled, and a flood of ice-cold rage poured through him. The world narrowed to the thief's hand, to the silver sanctuary it now desecrated. That locket was not a thing of value. It was a fragment of his soul. It was the last conversation, the final touch, the only tangible evidence that the man he once was had ever existed. The robber flipped open the clasp. He stared at the tiny faded portraits, within a cruel smirk twisting his lips. Well, now ain't that sweet? A little family. He made to pocket it. Time seemed to slow. Cole saw the leader stuffing sacks with money. He saw the nervous second robber inching toward the door. But all he truly felt was the violation. The quiet peace of his grief, the one thing he had left to guard, had been breached. His movement was a blur of contained violence. In one fluid motion, his right hand chopped down on the robber's wrist, striking the radial nerve with surgical precision. The man cried out, his fingers spasming open. The locket flew into the air. Cole's other hand shot out, catching it before it hit the floor, his fingers closing around the warm metal with a sense of desperate relief. The robber, enraged and humiliated, swung his pistol around to bear on Cole's chest. But Cole was already moving, flowing inside the arc of the weapon. He drove the heel of his palm up under the man's chin, snapping his head back with a sickening crack of vertebrae. The robber's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed in a boneless heap, unconscious before he hit the ground. The sudden, silent explosion of violence stunned the room. The leader whirled from the vault, his eyes wide with shock. The nervous robber at the door instinctively raised his gun. Cole didn't hesitate. He scooped up the fallen man's revolver, the familiar weight of it, a grim comfort in his hand. He fired once. The shot was not aimed to kill, but to disable. It struck the nervous robber in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own weapon clattering across the floor. Enough. Cole's voice was the crack of a whip cutting through the fear-soaked silence. He leveled the revolver at the leader, who stood frozen, half in and half out of the vault. "Leave the money. Walk away." The leader stared at Cole, seeing him for the first time not as a quiet prospector, but as something else entirely. Something dangerous and primal. He saw the cold certainty in Cole's eyes and the economy of motion that spoke of countless life-or-death encounters. He made a quick calculation, weighing a bag of money against his own life, and found the equation simple. With a curse, he dropped the sacks and backed away, grabbing his wounded companion and dragging him toward the door. As they stumbled out into the dusty street, the leader glanced back one last time, his eyes burning with a mixture of fear and hatred. "This ain't over," he yelled before disappearing into the chaos of the alarmed town. Cole ignored him. He lowered the revolver, the adrenaline draining away, leaving behind a hollow ache. The bank's customers and staff stared at him, their expressions a mixture of awe and terror. He was no longer an anonymous man. He was a specter from a dime novel, a killer who had appeared in their midst. He looked down at the locket clutched in his hand. The silver was dented from the fall. He thumbed it open. Mary and Daniel stared back at him, their faded images a silent testament to a world that no longer existed. He had protected their memory, but in doing so he had resurrected the very man he had tried to bury. The ghost was back, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the men who had violated his sanctuary would not simply be allowed to ride away. He had to hunt them. Not for justice, not for the town's money, but for the quiet sanctity of his own grief. He had to reclaim the peace they had stolen. 2 days later, and 100 miles to the north, Sarah Hargrove stepped off the stagecoach into the raw, unfinished town of Bitterroot Flats. The settlement was little more than a muddy street, carved from the wilderness, flanked by a collection of raw timber buildings that seemed to lean on each other for support. The air smelled of pine sap, wet earth, and the metallic tang of the nearby mining operations. It was a world away from the manicured lawns and polite society of Boston, a world she had to conquer to reclaim her father's legacy. She clutched the handle of her valise, the worn leather, a stark contrast to her tailored traveling suit. Her father, a man who had seen the West, not as a place of brutal conquest, but of boundless opportunity, had poured his life into the Hargrove mine. He had written to her weekly, his letters filled with geological surveys, heady descriptions of newfound veins, and a stubborn refusal to sell out to the powerful Thaddeus Thornton, a man who was buying up the territory one claim at a time. Then 6 weeks ago, the letters had stopped. A terse telegram had followed, delivered by a boy who hadn't met her eyes. A mining accident. A tragic cave-in. Official condolences from the territorial authorities. Sarah had not believed it for a second. Her father was the most meticulous, safety-conscious engineer she had ever known. An accident of that magnitude was not a matter of chance. It was an act of malice. Now she stood on the soil he had worked, a stranger, in a land that was legally hers, but felt alien and hostile. Thaddeus Thornton's name was on the sign of the largest building in town, the Thornton Consolidated Mining and Freight Office. His influence was a palpable presence, a weight in the air that seemed to press down on the entire valley. Her first stop was the local assayer's office, a small cluttered shack run by a man named Elias Jenkins, one of the few men her father had mentioned by name as being trustworthy. He was an old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes clouded by cataracts, but still sharp with intelligence. He recognized her name instantly. Sarah Hargrove. "You're the spitting image of your mother," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "Your father, he was a good man, a rare thing in these parts." "I don't believe his death was an accident, Mr. Jenkins," Sarah stated, plainly dispensing with pleasantries. Jenkins glanced nervously toward the door, then lowered his voice. "You'd be wise not to say such things too loudly, miss. Walls have ears in this town, and most of them belong to Thaddeus Thornton." He gestured for her to sit, his movements slow and deliberate. "Your father was sitting on the richest gold strike this side of the Dakotas. Thornton wanted it, offered him a fortune. When your father refused, the accident started. Equipment failures, small collapses, warnings. And the final cave-in," Sarah pressed her heart cold, "happened in a section of the mine that was known to be unstable. Your father would never have gone in there alone, not without reinforcing the shoring." Jenkins said, his conviction clear. "But the official report signed by a Judge Thornton keeps on his payroll said otherwise. Case closed. Thornton has taken control of the mine." Sarah said the words tasting like ash. "Moved his men in the day after the funeral," Jenkins confirmed. "Claimed he was securing the property on behalf of the sole heir, you pending the settlement of your father's outstanding debts. Debts, I might add, that mysteriously appeared on the town ledger right after he died." It was worse than she had imagined. Thornton hadn't just orchestrated her father's death. He had woven a legal web around her inheritance, strangling it before she could even lay claim to it. "What can I do?" Sarah asked, the helplessness in her voice infuriating her. Jenkins leaned forward, his expression grim. "Your father was a careful man, Miss Hargrove. He knew Thornton was a snake. He kept a private set of ledgers, detailed maps of the tunnel's notes on everything. He told me once if anything ever happened to him, the truth was hidden where no one would ever think to look." He paused. In the mine itself. Before he could elaborate, the bell above the office door jangled. 2 men entered, their faces hard, their hands resting on the butts of their holstered pistols. They wore the confident swagger of men who knew they were the law in this town, whether they wore a badge or not. Jenkins, the taller one, said, his eyes flicking from the old man to Sarah. Mr. Thornton heard Miss Hargrove had arrived. He'd like a word with her. At her convenience, of course. The man's smile was thin and predatory. It made it clear that convenience meant now. Sarah stood her back straight, her chin held high. She was outmatched and alone, but she would not show fear. Very well. Please inform Mr. Thornton I will call on him at his office. He insisted we escort you. The man replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. For your safety. Sarah looked at Jenkins, who gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. This was a summons, not an invitation. With a cold sense of dread, she allowed Thornton's men to lead her out into the muddy street and toward the imposing office of the man who had stolen her future. The trail of the bank robbers was easy to follow for a man with Cole's skills. They were careless, riding hard and leaving a clear path through the high country. He moved with a relentless ground-eating pace, foregoing sleep, subsisting on jerky and cold coffee. The hunter in him was reawakened, every sense honed to a razor's edge. He was not Cole Blackwood, the grieving recluse, anymore. He was the Ghost, a name whispered in fear around campfires from the Missouri to the Rockies. On the second day, he found the first of them, the nervous one. His horse had thrown a shoe, and his companions in their haste had left him behind. Cole found him trying to build a fire with damp wood, his wounded shoulder wrapped in a filthy bandage. The man looked up and saw Cole emerge from the trees, a silent specter of vengeance, and the color drained from his face. I don't want no more trouble, the man stammered, reaching for his gun. Where's the locket? Cole's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. The what? The silver locket. Your partner took it from me in the bank. Oh, that. Cutter has it. The boss, the man said, relaxing slightly, seeing that this wasn't about the bank's money. We split up back at the fork. Me and Jed were supposed to head for the Dakota border. Cutter, he said he had a job waiting for him. In the Bitterroots. A job for who? Cole pressed, moving closer. The man's eyes shifted. Some rich fella. Thornton. Paying good money for some extra guns. Said something about securing a mine. The name hung in the air between them. Thornton. The same name whispered by the prospectors in Pine Ridge, a name associated with power, ruthlessness, and unchecked ambition. And now the man who had stolen the last piece of Cole's past was riding to join him. The two threads of violence, one random and one calculated, were twisting together. Where in the Bitterroots? He didn't say exactly. Just that he was to meet Thornton's foreman at a place called Bitterroot Flats, and the man confessed, eager to please. Look, you can have my share of the money. Just let me go. Cole stared at the man, a pathetic creature caught up in something far beyond his understanding. He felt nothing. Not pity, not anger. Just a vast, cold emptiness. Get on your horse and ride east, Cole said, turning away. If I ever see your face again, I'll kill you. He didn't wait to see the man obey. He was already moving, heading back toward the fork in the trail. His path was clear now. It led north to Bitterroot Flats, to a man named Thornton, and to the thief called Cutter, who held the key to his past. The world could have its stolen money and its mining disputes. All Cole Blackwood wanted was to get his ghosts back. His journey brought him through a landscape of stark, breathtaking beauty. Jagged peaks clawed at a sky so blue it hurt the eyes, their slopes cloaked in the deep green of ponderosa pines. The air grew thinner, cleaner, smelling of pine resin and cold stone. It was a land that demanded respect, a land that could kill a man as easily as a bullet. He rode into the valley housing Bitterroot Flats as dusk was painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. He saw the raw cluster of buildings and the deep scars of the mines on the surrounding hills. And he saw two men roughly escorting a woman across the muddy street. Ordinarily, he would have ridden past. It was not his business. But something in the woman's posture, the defiant tilt of her chin as she was forced along, snagged his attention. And then he recognized one of the men. It was the wiry, rat-faced robber from the bank, the one he'd knocked unconscious. The one whose partner, Cutter, had his locket. The cold rage from the bank reignited in Cole's gut. These men were part of the crew that had violated his peace. They were connected to the man he was hunting. Their business had just become his. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, tethering his horse to a hitching rail in front of the saloon. He moved across the street with a purpose that made other men step aside. He was no longer trying to be invisible. "Let her go," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the evening quiet like a blade. The two men stopped, turning to face him. The rat-faced man's eyes widened in disbelief and fear. "You," he gasped. "You're supposed to be—" "I'm here for what your boss stole from me." Cole set his gaze fixed on the man. "But we can start with you." The second man, a burly oaf who clearly supplied the muscle, sneered. "This ain't your concern, Drifter. We're on Mr. Thornton's business." "I don't care if you're on the president's business," Cole replied, his hand hovering over the butt of his Colt. "Let her go." Sarah watched the confrontation, her own fear momentarily forgotten in her surprise. This stranger, this grim, travel-worn man, had appeared from nowhere, a guardian angel clad in dust and leather. His eyes fixed on her captors were the coldest things she had ever seen. The burly man made his mistake. He drew his gun. He was fast, but Cole was faster. Cole's Colt seemed to leap into his hand. A single shot cracked through the twilight air. The burly man grunted, his gun flying from a hand that was suddenly a bloody ruin of shattered bones. He stared at it, his face a comical mask of shock, before stumbling back, clutching the wound. The rat-faced man froze his hand, stalled halfway to his own pistol. He was staring death in the face, and he knew it. "Where is he?" Cole's voice was a low growl. "Cutter. Where is he?" He rode out to the main camp. Up at the mine, the man stammered, his bravado gone. "He's with the foreman." "We're leaving," Cole said, turning his cold gaze to Sarah. She nodded, understanding that this man, whoever he was her only hope. As they turned to walk away, a voice smooth as oiled silk and cold as a grave stopped them. "That's quite enough." Thaddeus Thornton stood on the boardwalk in front of his office. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his dark hair perfectly combed. He was handsome, but it was a predator's beauty, all sharp angles and watchful stillness. Behind him stood 4 more armed men, their rifles held at a casual but ready angle. "You must be Miss Hargrove Thornton," said his eyes, ignoring Cole completely as they settled on Sarah. His smile was polished, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I am Thaddeus Thornton. I am so sorry for the enthusiastic nature of my men. I merely wish to ensure your safe arrival and offer you my hospitality." "I require neither your concern nor your hospitality." "Mr. Thornton," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I only require that you vacate my father's property." Thornton's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "A matter for the courts to decide, I'm afraid. There are outstanding debts." He finally deigned to look at Cole. "And you are a man looking for something that was stolen from me," Cole said. "Indeed," Thornton mused. He nodded to the rat-faced man. "It seems this gentleman has a dispute with my new employee." "Settle it." It was a death sentence delivered with the casual indifference of a king ordering an appetizer. The rat-faced man, seeing his chance to redeem himself, drew his pistol. But Cole was already moving. He shoved Sarah behind him, drew, and fired in a single continuous motion. The shot was perfect. The rat-faced man collapsed, a neat hole in the center of his forehead, his unfired pistol thudding into the mud beside him. Silence descended on the street. Thornton's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something interest, perhaps even respect, danced in his cold eyes. He studied Cole more closely now. "Impressive," Thornton said softly. "You have a name." "He's called the Ghost," one of Thornton's men whispered, his voice tight with fear. The name registered with Thornton. A slow, deeply unsettling smile spread across his face. It was a smile of dawning, horrific recognition, as if a long-forgotten piece of a complex puzzle had just clicked into place. Cole. The ghost, Blackwood Thornton, breathed the name a strange caress. Well, of all the men in all the world to walk into my town. He chuckled, a low, chilling sound. This changes everything. This makes it so much more personal. He raised a hand, stopping his men before they could raise their rifles. "Let them go," he commanded, his eyes locked on Cole. The command was so unexpected, it stunned everyone, including his own men. "Sir," his foreman asked, confused. "This is not a common drifter, gentlemen. This is a legend," Thornton said, his voice laced with a strange, predatory glee. "And a legend deserves a proper hunt. Let them go. The game has just begun." He turned and walked back into his office without a backward glance, leaving Cole and Sarah standing in the middle of the street with a dead man at their feet and the chilling certainty that they had just stumbled into a trap that had been years in the making. Cole had come for a locket, but he had found something else entirely, a ghost from his own past, wearing a different face and orchestrating a revenge he couldn't yet comprehend. The wilderness offered a temporary sanctuary. Cole led Sarah north, away from the mine and the town, pushing their horses hard through the deepening twilight. The scent of ozone hung in the air, a promise of a coming storm that would help cover their tracks. They rode in silence, the events in Bitterroot Flats hanging between them, too raw for immediate discussion. Sarah, though shaken, kept pace, her resilience a quiet surprise to Cole. They made a cold camp in a shallow ravine, sheltered by an overhang of granite. The first drops of rain began to patter on the rock above them as Cole secured the horses. "He let us go," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was a mixture of confusion and fear. "Why?" Cole stared into the darkness, his thoughts churning. Thornton's reaction, that chilling smile of recognition, the almost joyful proclamation that the game had begun, didn't make sense. It was the reaction of a man who hadn't just met an obstacle, but had seen a long-awaited prophecy fulfilled. "He knows you," Sarah stated. "The way he said your name. The ghost." "It was a long time ago," Cole said, his voice rough. He checked the action on his rifle, the familiar metallic sounds, a small comfort. "I was a U.S. Marshal. Hunted men for a living. And one of them was connected to Thornton," she surmised, putting the pieces together. Cole didn't answer directly. The past was a locked room, and he had no desire to give her the key. But the lock had been picked. The name Thornton had used, Thomas Caldwell, was a ghost he had tried to outrun for years. A bounty hunt gone wrong. A man he'd been hired to bring in, dead or alive. A man who, according to the official army report, was a traitor selling secrets. Cole had brought him in, He had collected the bounty and tried to forget the man's desperate claims of innocence. Now it seemed the dead man had a brother. A brother who had reinvented himself as a mining magnate, who had patiently waited, and who had just found the man responsible for his family's ruin. The theft of the locket suddenly seemed less like a random act of a common thief and more like a deliberate lure. Cutter the robber hadn't just been hired for a job. He'd been sent on a mission to find Cole Blackwood and draw him into Thornton's web. "This isn't about your father's mine anymore, is it?" Sarah's voice cut through his dark thoughts. She was sharp, piecing together the grim puzzle with unnerving accuracy. "It's about you. The mine my father made." "We were just the bait." Cole finally looked at her. In the faint light filtering through the rain, he saw not the terrified woman from the street, but a partner in his grim new reality. "It seems so," he admitted. "Then we have a common enemy," she said, her resolve hardening. "And I have something that might help us. Mr. Jenkins, the assayer, said my father hid his private records in the mine. The mine is the one place Thornton will expect us to go, Cole countered. Exactly, she replied, echoing a logic he himself might have used. It's the heart of his new empire. He'll have it guarded, but he'll be looking for us out here in the wilderness. He won't expect us to walk right back into the lion's den. She paused, then pressed her advantage. Those records could contain more than just proof of my father's murder. They might contain information on Thornton himself, this Thomas Caldwell. Something we can use against him. Cole considered it. Her logic was sound. It was a dangerous, almost suicidal plan, but it was better than running blindly. Thornton was hunting him. Running would only delay the inevitable. To end this, he had to face the ghost he had created. All right, he said, the decision made. We rest until the storm passes, then we circle back. We'll go in through one of the old ventilation shafts on the north slope. Less likely to be watched. As the storm broke over the mountains, they huddled together under the rock overhang for warmth. The wind howled through the ravine like a tormented spirit, and lightning briefly illuminated the stark landscape, casting their faces in a ghostly fleeting light. In that shared fragile shelter, a silent pact was formed. They were no longer two strangers with separate goals, but allies bound by a single obsessive vendetta that spanned years and stretched across the blood-soaked plains of the past. 2 days later, they lay on a ridge overlooking the Hargrove mine. The operation was a hive of activity, far busier than it had ever been under Sarah's father. New buildings had been erected, a spur line for a future railroad was being graded, and armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Thornton was not just mining gold, he was building an empire. The northern slope is clear, Cole murmured, lowering his spyglass. The ventilation shaft should be just below that stand of aspens. They made their way down under the cover of darkness, moving with the silence of shadows. The air grew colder as they approached the mine, the smell of damp earth and blasting powder thick in their nostrils. Sarah led them to the shaft, its entrance a dark maw in the mountainside, partially hidden by a rockfall and overgrown brush. My father showed this to me when I was a girl, she whispered. He called it his escape hatch. The irony was not lost on either of them. They slipped inside the darkness enveloping them. Cole lit a small lantern, its light pushing back the oppressive gloom, revealing a narrow descending tunnel shored up with ancient weeping timbers. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the profound silence of the earth's deep places. Sarah navigated from memory, and a small map she'd sketched from her father's letters, leading them through a labyrinth of intersecting tunnels. They passed signs of Thornton's new operation, freshly laid track new, timbering the distant clang of machinery. But the sections they traversed were old and largely abandoned. His office was on the 3rd level, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. It connected to the main shaft, but he had a private study built back in an old assaying chamber. That's where he would have kept his personal records. They found the office, its door locked. Cole made short work of it with his knife, the tumblers clicking open with a soft snick. The room was just as her father had left it, coated in a fine layer of dust. A large desk, geological maps on the walls, and a shelf of leather-bound books. It was a scholar's room, not a miner's. He said it was hidden where no one would think to look, Sarah murmured, running her hand along a row of geology textbooks. She paused, her fingers tracing the spine of a thick volume asterisk, a comprehensive study of sedimentary rock formations, asterisk. He made me read this as a girl. I hated it. A faint smile touched her lips. He said, the most valuable things are often hidden in the plainest wrappers. She pulled the book from the shelf. It was heavier than it should have been. Inside the pages had been hollowed out, creating a secret compartment. Nestled within was a slim leather-bound journal, her father's private log. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it. The first few pages were filled with her father's familiar, precise script, detailing mineral assays and operational notes. But then the entries changed. Asterisk October 12th, asterisk 1 read. Asterisk Thornton is not who he says he is. A conversation with an old Army surveyor today confirmed my suspicions. Thornton's real name is Thomas Caldwell. His family was from Kansas. His older brother, Elias Caldwell, was killed during a bounty hunt near the Cheyenne River 10 years ago. The official report named the marshal as Cole, the Ghost, Blackwood. Cole felt the air leave his lungs. Seeing the names written down, a piece of his past, unearthed and laid bare, was like taking a physical blow. Sarah continued reading, her voice a hushed, horrified whisper. Asterisk Elias Caldwell was accused of selling Army payroll schedules to the Sioux. But I never believed it. He was a good man, a surveyor like me. He claimed he had uncovered a massive fraud, an Army procurement officer selling new Spencer rifles directly to the war chief Crazy Horse, then reporting the shipments as lost or damaged. Elias was on his way to Fort Laramie with proof when Blackwood caught up to him. He was silenced. The midpoint twist landed with the force of an avalanche, burying Cole under the weight of his own history. It wasn't just a simple revenge plot. Thornton Thomas Caldwell believed Cole had murdered his brother to cover up a conspiracy. His entire life for the past decade must have been a cold, calculated quest for vengeance. The mine, the wealth, the power. It was all just a means to an end. The end was Cole Blackwood. He thinks you killed his brother to protect a corrupt Army officer, Sarah said, looking up from the journal, her eyes wide with the enormity of the discovery. I was just a Marshal. Cole said, the words feeling hollow even to him. I had a warrant. This journal is the proof, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. My father was investigating the original conspiracy. He has names, dates, shipment records he pieced together. This is why Thornton killed him. And this is how we can destroy him. A loud crash echoed from the main tunnel outside the office, followed by shouts. They've found us. Cole grabbed the journal from her, shoving it inside his coat. He extinguished the lantern, plunging them into absolute darkness. There's another way out. Your father's map showed a connection to the natural caverns from this level. They felt their way out of a secondary door in the study, stumbling into a rough-hewn tunnel that sloped steeply downward. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, lantern light flickering at the end of the corridor. The air changed, the dry, dusty smell of the mine, replaced by a cool, damp scent. The tunnel opened into a vast, breathtaking cavern, a natural cathedral of stalactites and stalagmites. A wooden walkway, slick with moisture, spanned a deep black chasm. This way, Sarah urged, pointing across the chasm. The smuggling tunnels connect to the other side. They lead out to the south. They ran across the precarious bridge, the shouts of Thornton's men echoing in the vast chamber behind them. As they reached the other side, a figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking their path. It was Cutter, the bank robber, the man with Cole's locket. He held a shotgun leveled at them, a triumphant leer on his face. End of the line, Ghost, he sneered. From the other end of the bridge, more of Thornton's men appeared, trapping them. And in their midst, walking with unhurried, regal confidence, was Thaddeus Thornton himself. I must admit, Thornton said, his voice echoing in the cavern. I'm impressed. To have gotten this far. His eyes were not on Sarah, but were fixed on Cole with an intensity that was terrifying. Did you find what you were looking for, Blackwood? A little light reading about the sins of the past, he knew. He had known about the journal all along. This was not a chase. It was a carefully orchestrated checkmate. Give me the journal, Thornton commanded. Cole's hand went to the journal inside his coat. For a moment he considered it. But then he looked at Sarah, at the defiant courage in her eyes, and he knew he could not surrender. He had run from his past for 5 years. He would not run anymore. You'll have to take it, Cole said. Thornton's smile was chilling. As you wish. He nodded to Cutter. Cutter grinned and raised the shotgun. But as he did, His eyes flicked down to Cole's chest, where the broken chain from the locket still hung. Cole saw the flicker of recognition, the moment of greed. "The locket," Cole said, his voice low and clear. "Give it back." Cutter laughed. "This old thing, finders keepers." In that split second of distraction, Cole acted. He shoved Sarah to the side and dove forward, not at Cutter, but at the main support pillar for the wooden bridge. He had noticed it earlier. The timber was rotten, weakened by the constant dampness. He slammed his full weight against it. The wood groaned, splintered, and then snapped. With a horrific tearing sound, the bridge collapsed into the chasm, taking a half-dozen of Thornton's men screaming into the blackness below. Cutter, caught by surprise, fired his shotgun, the blast echoing like a thunderclap. The buckshot tore through the space where Cole had been peppering the rock wall. Cole, already on the ground, fired his own revolver. The shot caught Cutter in the chest, throwing him backward off the ledge and into the abyss. As Cutter fell, his hand opened reflexively. A small silver object flew through the air, glinting in the lantern light. Cole lunged, catching it just before it followed its owner into the darkness. The locket, dented and scratched, but safe. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing Sarah's hand. Thornton stood on the far side of the chasm, his face a mask of incandescent fury, his perfect plan shattered. "You can't escape, Blackwood," he roared, his voice filled with the promise of a terrible retribution. "There is nowhere on this earth you can hide from me." "Not hiding anymore," Caldwell Cole yelled back. He turned, pulling Sarah into the darkness of the smuggling tunnels. They were alive. They had the journal, and Cole had his locket. But they were trapped deep inside a mountain, owned by a man who now had nothing to lose, and whose hatred had been honed to a razor's edge. The hunt had become a war. The chase through the mountains was brutal and relentless. Thornton, consumed by a fury that bordered on madness, threw every man he had into the hunt. They were no longer just fugitives. They were the personal obsession of the most powerful man in the territory. Cole used every trick he had ever learned, every piece of hard-won knowledge from his years as the Ghost, to keep them one step ahead of the pursuit. He laid false trails, used the rugged terrain to their advantage, and pushed them both to the limits of their endurance. Days blurred into a grueling rhythm of riding, hiding, and running. They ate what they could forage, slept in snatches in hidden caves and dense thickets. Through the shared hardship, a bond of trust and mutual respect formed between them. Cole saw in Sarah a strength she probably never knew she possessed. She never complained, never faltered, her quiet determination a match for his own grim resolve. Sarah, in turn, saw beneath Cole's cold exterior, to the man haunted by his past, a man who fought with such ferocity not just for survival, but for a redemption he believed was beyond his grasp. Their goal was Fort Ellis, where they hoped to find Marshal Harker, an old colleague of Cole's, and one of the few lawmen in the territory rumored to be immune to Thornton's influence. The journal was their only weapon, its pages filled with the truth that could dismantle Thornton's empire and expose the conspiracy that had cost both their families so much. They were cornered in a high canyon as a storm born in the jagged peaks of the Gallatin Range descended upon them. The sky turned a bruised, malevolent purple, and the wind howled with the voice of a banshee. Below them, a half-constructed railroad trestle spanned a deep, rocky gorge, one of Thornton's own projects. It was their only way across. On the far side lay the open country leading to the fort. Behind them, closing in, were Thornton's men. "We have to cross," Cole said over the rising wind, his voice grim. They urged their exhausted horses onto the trestle. The bridge was a skeleton of wood and steel with gaping holes between the railroad ties where a man could fall hundreds of feet to the rocks below. The wind tore at them, trying to rip them from the narrow path, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, slicking the wooden beams. They were halfway across when figures appeared at the far end of the bridge. It was Thornton and a half-dozen of his most loyal men. At the same time, more men appeared at the entrance behind them. They were trapped, nowhere left to run. Blackwood Thornton's voice was snatched by the wind, but his intent was clear. He stood in the center of the bridge, a man embracing the storm, as if it were an ally, his face illuminated by a sudden flash of lightning. "This ends here," Cole yelled back. He dismounted, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. "Get behind me," he ordered Sarah. The world erupted into a maelstrom of wind, rain, and gunfire. Bullets splintered the wood around them, whining as they ricocheted off the steel rails. Cole returned fire, his shots precise and deadly, using the support beams for cover. The fight was a chaotic, terrifying ballet on a stage suspended over oblivion. One of Thornton's men, attempting to get a better angle, slipped on the wet wood and fell screaming into the gorge. Another clutched his chest as one of Cole's bullets found its mark. But they were outnumbered, and their position was perilously exposed. Then Thornton did something unexpected. He held up a hand, and his men ceased firing. He began to walk toward them alone, his long coat flapping in the wind like the wings of a great dark bird. "Let's end this as it began, Blackwood," he called out. "Between you and me, the man who destroyed my family and the man who will avenge it." He drew a revolver, but let it hang loosely at his side. This was to be more than a gunfight. It was a final personal reckoning. "You think killing me will bring your brother back?" Cole shouted, the rifle still trained on Thornton's chest. "No," Thornton replied, his voice eerily calm amidst the storm's fury. "But it will bring justice. Something you know nothing about." He stopped at 20 paces from them. Lightning flashed again, and in that stark, brutal light, Cole saw something that made his blood run cold. Hanging from a chain around Thornton's neck was a silver locket, a mirror image of his own. "My brother wasn't just an innocent man," Thornton said, his voice rising in intensity. "He was a patriot. He discovered that a corrupt army officer, a Major Williamson, was selling rifles to the Sioux. Your own army supplying the weapons that were killing soldiers and settlers. My brother was going to expose him. He had proof. That's why he had to be silenced." The words struck Cole with the force of a physical blow. A pawn. He hadn't just killed an innocent man. He had been a tool, a weapon used by the very corruption he was supposed to be fighting. His entire career as the Ghost and the reputation he had built on a foundation of grim justice was a lie. "And Williamson Cole?" asked, his voice hoarse. "He hired the best manhunter in the territories to clean up his mess." Thornton sneered, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. "He hired you, Ghost. You weren't a lawman that day. You were just a cleaner, a pawn in his game. And you did your job perfectly." The revelation shattered the last of Cole's defenses. He had killed an innocent, a good man, and in doing so had become an accomplice to treason. His entire solitary penance, his years of grief and isolation, were built on a corrupt foundation. Seeing the truth dawn on Cole's face, Thornton raised his pistol. "Now you know," he hissed. "Now you can die knowing what you truly are." But as he aimed, Sarah moved. She had been inching along the beams, her own pistol in hand. She fired her shot, going wide in the gale-force wind, but forcing Thornton to flinch. The distraction was all Cole needed. He charged forward, dropping his rifle and drawing his Colt. The final confrontation was not a long-range gunfight, but a brutal close-quarters struggle on the slick, narrow beams of the bridge. They grappled, slipping and sliding over the abyss, the storm raging around them. It was a fight between two ghosts, two men defined by the same past tragedy. Thornton fought with the fury of a decade of hatred. Cole fought with the desperate strength of a man whose soul hung in the balance. He knocked the gun from Thornton's hand, but Thornton drove a knife up into his side. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot through Cole. He staggered back, his boots slipping off the edge of a tie. For a heart-stopping moment, he dangled over the gorge, clinging to a steel rail with one hand. Thornton stood over him, the bloody knife in his hand, a look of ultimate victory on his face. "This is for Elias," he screamed over the wind. He raised the knife for the final blow. But as he did, a single gunshot echoed sharp and clear, even above the storm. Thornton froze. A small, dark hole appeared on his chest. He looked down at it in disbelief, then his gaze shifted past Cole to Sarah, who stood 20 feet away, the pistol held steady in her 2 hands. Thornton looked at Cole, a flicker of his brother's locket visible at his throat. His expression of hatred softened into something lost and empty. He opened his mouth, but the wind stole his final words. He swayed a puppet with its strings cut, and then toppled backward off the bridge, swallowed by the raging storm and the blackness of the gorge below. Cole hauled himself back onto the trestle, collapsing onto the wet wood, his hand pressed against the bleeding wound in his side. Sarah rushed to him, her face pale in the flashing lightning. The remaining henchmen, their leader gone, were already retreating, vanishing back into the storm. He was alive. He looked at the locket in his hand, then thought of the one that had just fallen into the abyss. He had survived, but the victory felt as hollow as the wind. He had won a battle for his life, but the war for his soul was far from over. Marshal Harker arrived with 2 deputies an hour later, drawn by the sounds of the gunfight. They found Cole and Sarah huddled at the far end of the trestle, the storm beginning to subside. Harker, a man whose face seemed carved from granite, took in the scene with a practiced eye, the bodies, the abandoned weapons, the blood on the bridge. He listened to their story in silence, his expression unreadable, as Sarah presented him with her father's journal. He read key passages, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he finally looked up, his gaze rested on Cole. Major Williamson Harker said the name tasting like rust. I've suspected him for years. Never had anything solid to move on. He tapped the journal. This changes things. This is enough to go to the Judge Advocate General, to Washington. The full weight of the conspiracy Thornton had been a part of began to unravel. It was bigger than smuggling, bigger than one corrupt officer. It was a network of greed that reached into the highest levels of the territorial government and the military. Harker's arrival was not that of a savior, but of a lawman faced with the daunting task of cleaning a wound that ran to the bone. Cole and Sarah spent hours giving their statements, the grim details of their ordeal laid bare under the cold, impartial light of the law. Weeks later, the autumn sun cast a gentle golden light over the small cemetery outside Pine Ridge. 2 simple wooden markers stood side by side, asterisk, Mary Blackwood asterisk, and asterisk, Daniel Blackwood asterisk. Cole stood before them, Sarah, a quiet, steady presence at his side. The wound in his side had healed into a puckered scar, a physical reminder of the deeper wounds within. The investigation in Helena had exploded, leading to arrests that had shaken the territory. Major Williamson had been taken into federal custody, and the evidence from the Hargrove Journal had implicated a dozen other officials. The cycle of corruption for a time was broken. Cole reached into his coat. He pulled out his old tarnished Ghost Wanted poster, its edges frayed from years of being folded and unfolded. He looked at the crude drawing of the younger, harder man. He had been a man who had dealt in death and called it justice. He knelt and began to dig a small hole in the earth with his hands. Next, he took out 2 silver lockets. One was his own, its surface now bearing the scars of his journey. The other he had recovered from the gorge below the trestle, a small miracle in the aftermath of the storm. It was Thornton's Thomas Caldwell's, and it held the image of his brother Elias. He looked at the face of the man he had killed, the man whose death had set in motion a decade of pain and revenge. He saw not a traitor, but a man with honest eyes. He placed the locket belonging to Thornton's brother into the hole. He was not burying an enemy. He was laying a ghost to rest. Then he placed his wanted poster on top of it. He covered them both with earth, packing it down firmly. He was burying the ghost, breaking the cycle of violence that had consumed his life and Thomas Caldwell's. He stood, his own locket held tightly in his hand. He did not bury it. Mary and Daniel were not ghosts to be laid to rest. They were memories to be carried forward, not as a burden of grief, but as a reminder of the man he could be. Sarah, now the rightful owner and operator of the Hargrove mine, watched him understanding the silent ceremony. In the weeks since the climax on the bridge, she had found her own form of closure. While sorting through her father's effects from the mine office, she had found a final letter he had written to her, tucked away inside the very geology book that had hidden his journal. It didn't speak of mines, or money, or Thaddeus Thornton. It spoke only of his profound love for her, his unshakable belief in her strength, and his hope that she would build a future filled with more joy than sorrow. Her victory was not just in defeating a villain, but in honoring that hope. Cole turned from the graves, his eyes clear for the first time in years. The shadows were still there, but they no longer held dominion. He looked at Sarah, at the woman who had walked through the fire with him, and emerged like him, scarred but whole. They did not speak of love or marriage. Their bond had been forged in something deeper than words. They stood together, side by side, and looked not at each other, but out at the vast horizon, at the jagged peaks of the mountains that stood sentinel over the valley. The past was a landscape they had traveled through, and it had shaped them. But now, for the first time, the future was a territory of their own, choosing a blank map waiting for them to draw the trail forward together.